Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 2 in our continuing study of the general epistles. Back in Hebrews chapter 1, the big idea there was that angels are great, they are mighty, they are awesome, but Jesus is better. And we saw that all throughout chapter 1. Chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, on that theme, asked the question, it's a rhetorical question, but to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? He never said that about angels. To the contrary, verse 14, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? Angels are servants. They're spirit servants, but they're servants. And they're sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. Notice that word salvation, because we're going to see it again in the next chapter. Well, that brings us now to chapter 2 and verse 1. For this reason, for the reason that Jesus is better than the angels, for this reason we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from it. This is the first warning clause that we see. We're going to see a number of warnings throughout the epistle to the Hebrews, and this is the first one. We have to be careful not to drift away. Have you ever seen a boat that was at anchor and then, oops, somebody forgot to throw out the anchor and the boat begins to drift? Don't let your Christian life drift. That's the idea here. And remember, this is written to Hebrews, Jewish Christians, who are in danger of drifting away, in their case, from Jesus. And so, verse 2, for if the word spoken through angels, there's our angels again, proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? You see, if angels are great, but the Son is greater, and if you went against angels, you were going against something very big, because when angels said something, hey, that was unalterable. It didn't get changed. How much worse is it if you leave Jesus, if we neglect so great a salvation that has to do with the one who's better than the angels? And so angels are one thing, Jesus is another. The law then, you see that's what they had been under before they heard about Jesus. That had been brought through angels. And that was good. The law was great. Angels were mighty. But salvation was brought through the Son of God. And he is better than the angels. The law, the angels were great. They had been involved in bringing the law. But the Son is greater. Under the law, the neglect of the law brought forth certain judgment. That was a dangerous thing. How much worse it is, neglect of salvation, is certain to bring even greater judgment. And that's the point that's made here. The rest of verse 3, after it was at first spoken through the Lord, that is, that salvation, that message of salvation, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. Notice, it went from Jesus to those whom Jesus taught, like the apostles, like Peter, like Paul, like others. But then it was confirmed to us, verse 4, God also testifying with them, both by signs and wonders, and by various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to his own will. Notice, even the Spirit of God got into it. It wasn't just angels versus the Son. The Spirit threw in his testimony, threw in his witness behind that as well. Verse 5, for he did not subject to angels the world to come. Notice angels again, concerning that which we are speaking. But one has testified somewhere, saying, what is man that you remember him? Or the Son of Man that you are concerned about him? You think angels are great? Look at what God did with man. Verse 7, you have made him for a little while lower than the angels. Angels were great. And yet you did something with mankind. Even back in the Old Testament, it was prophesied. Notice, you have crowned him with glory and honor and have appointed him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. Now notice that term subjection, because we're going to see that repeated in just a second. In other words, angels were they were terrific and they were wonderful and they were powerful. But God has done something with mankind and with the Son of Man, we're going to see that in a minute, by putting all things in subjection under his feet. That goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, where God made man in his image and said, rule over the earth and rule over all things. Of course, it's under the headship of God. Rest of verse 8, for in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him, but now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. Not everything answers to mankind. But we do see him. Notice, I think the him is, and the translators tried to tell us that by capitalizing it. And I think they're right. But we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, in other words, Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for every man. You see, God had done something special with mankind, but he did something even better with Jesus. Even though Jesus was taken and for a little while lower than the angels, in other words, he became a man. And yet, because of the suffering of death, he won over death. He was crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For a little while he was subject. He was lower than the angels. But that's so that he can be lifted up and that he can be seen to be better. It was the suffering of death that brought that about. That was a low thing. To suffer, to die, a Messiah that died, unheard of. But Jesus took that so that by taking that he might be raised up and exalted. And so, verse 5, we see the role of the angels. The world is not subject to the angels as it is to Jesus. In verses 6 through 8, man has been elevated to a position just a little lower than the angels, but everything isn't presently subject to him. However, in the case of Jesus, Jesus was made a man, made a little lower than the angels, like the rest of people, in order that he might be exalted above all. Verse 10, for it was fitting for him, Jesus that is, for whom are all things and through whom are all things, in bringing many, notice that word, sons to glory. We're going to move from subjection to a son theme. In bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. Those sufferings were necessary in order, notice the big idea here, to bring many sons to glory. Now verse 11, both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified, Jesus is the one who sanctified, we're the ones who are sanctified, in other words made holy, are all from one Father. A father. Father indicates a son or a child. And remember, he's going to bring many sons to glory. Well, we're all from one. Father is understood. It's not actually in the text, but that's the idea. If you've got a bunch of children, they came from one parent. For which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, sons, many sons. If there's many sons, that means they're brothers. And he's not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And he quotes the Old Testament to show that the Old Testament prophesied that he was going to bring many brethren. He was going to bring many sons. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God has given me. And so that children theme is something that had been promised in the Old Testament. You see, the Old Testament promised that God would bring many sons, many children, that they would be children of the Messiah. This was an Old Testament teaching. Verse 14, therefore, since the children, those children that were promised, share in flesh and blood, because after all, if you've got brothers and sisters, they're all from one, they all share in flesh and blood. Since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That subjection that we talked about earlier, he became flesh and blood. He became our, can I say it this way? He became our brother. Or actually, we become his when we trust in him. so that that to which we were subject might be overcome, so that we might be released. Verse 16, for assuredly he does not give help. Remember our friends the angels? He does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendant, another term for the son, or for the brothers, the children. He gives help to the, actually literally it's the word seed. He gives help to the seed of Abraham, but it's the same idea. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren, because who are his brethren? The seed. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Now we've got a new concept being introduced. It's going to be more fully developed later on. But let's talk about it right here. Notice he had to be a faithful high priest. And that idea of the high priest is going to be, it was hinted at earlier, it's suggested here, it will be developed later on, where Jesus is going to be seen, yes, as a prophet, yes, as a king, but especially here in Hebrews, as our high priest in things pertaining to God, in order to make, and a word here, a big long word, we hardly ever use it today, propitiation. It means something that has satisfied anger, that has assuaged, that's not a word we use to, but has overcome or assuaged or satisfied anger, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Propitiation assumes that there's been anger, wrath, some wrong that's been done, and propitiation is the action that deals with that in a just and right way. Well, verse 18, for since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, speaking of Jesus, he is able to come to the aid of those who were tempted. You see, Jesus was tempted just by life. And notice, in that which he has suffered. This is ultimately seen in the cross, where he took upon himself our penalty, our suffering. And because he took our suffering upon himself, he is able to come to the aid of those who were tempted. He was tempted like we are tempted. He was tempted to say, I don't want to do that. And yet he did. He resisted temptation. And because of that, he can come and be a help to us when we are tempted. Have you ever gone to a doctor who has no sense of empathy? You say, gee, I'm feeling this pain or that pain, and they've never experienced pain in their life, so they, okay, I'll write that in a notebook. But they can't really feel with you. As opposed to somebody who can say, yes, I know what that's like. I've been there. I've done that. Jesus says to us, I've been there. I've done that. I understand. And because of that, he's able to come to our aid when we are tempted.